Great to be here. Thank you for being here. And I'm very happy that I'm going to be leading a conversation with two incredibly smart and insightful people, Cyrus Couture and Ronnie Howard. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their work. But before I do that, and before we start having a conversation about what I call the wild, wild west and wearable technology, I want to just give a little introduction on what is leading the thinking behind the framework of our conversation. So in the past few years, we've been hearing a lot about wearable technology. As you see, it's something that consumers are very interested. If you look at Google Trends, it's one of the most searched term. Depending on what you read, the market is going to really explode in the wearable technology field. Some predictions say it's going to be $70 billion by 2025. Some others will predict it to about $120 billion. And then you have e-textiles, right? So we talk about wearable technology and e-textiles. If you look at e-textiles, that's also a market that is anticipated to have great growth. And if you talk to people in the tech industry, they'll tell you that it's the wearable technology is really the next big thing, which is maybe why you have companies like in the technology space, like Google, investing in new development and in new experimentation, like the Jacquard project. And in some ways, when Google talks about why they're working with textiles and looking at clothes, well, they'll tell you that, and also Intel, investing in a platform for wearable technology, what they call the Curie. In the case of Intel, thank you. In the case of Intel, they feel that they very much missed out on the smartphone revolution. And if we believe that the Internet of Things is a $3 trillion industry, well, we safe to expect that our clothes will have some technology. In other words, when Google talks about why they are getting into this market, in 2012, there were 120 million units in smartphones sold, but 19 billion garments sold. So you see there is a market opportunity here that many people are looking to become part of. Or, as someone from DuPont who is actually developing stretchable electronics says, clothes will always outsell phones. And so when we talk about wearable computing or wearable technology or e-textiles, how did we get here? Is this really a new thing? Well, you can date wearable computing in the late 1990s with MIT's wearable computing group. But in fact, we've been wearing technology for a long time, whether it is in glasses that many of you wear today, in pocket watches, etc. And even in the way that we think about wearable technology today, even all the way back to 1968, the Museum of Contemporary Crafts, today the Museum of Art and Design, mounted a really extremely interesting exhibition. In fact, Sarah was the one who a few years ago told me about it, called Body Coverings, where you see what people in '68 trying to do, what we still haven't managed to do. In other words, create garments that they can cool and heat with using electronics and many other ideas. And then you have, even from the more expressive point of view, Diana Dew, who was an aeromechanical engineer experimenting with electroluminescent light. And you will see, of course, if you notice too, she's wearing a big pack, that's the battery, right? So we're doing the same things, but we are streamlining them and changing them in many ways. And of course, this idea of us wanting to bring our portable environment with us is also not new. So this is what a portable radio was in 1923. Of course, it's very different today, right? And in the early 2000s, we saw a lot of what I call more like wiring garments, less than, not really wearables. But again, how can we incorporate phones and touch sensors in clothing? You couldn't find a sports jacket that didn't have any of these bus wiring technologies. But we've also been looking at technology in fashion as a means of expression, of exploration, of this magic that fashion is, right? How do you create more lyrical, or this notion of fashion as delight, and experimenting with new ways of framing technology? And anyone from, Alexander McQueen famously in 1999 had on the catwalk his circuit board girl. Of course, Hussein Chalayan, who in many ways has been a leader of exploring fashion and technology, but most of these instances are always in the catwalk. We have in Cute Circuit is a company in London. They already had now 3 Fashion Week shows, but they're in very specific niche, if you will. So when we think about wearable technology, we mostly think of Fitbits and accessories. And we saw yesterday a near-field communication pearl. We've seen them also in watches. And this idea that now the luxury market is trying to understand how they fit into the world of wearable technology. And we start to see actual technology in garments, most notably and popularly in shirts. So garments that really sit very close to the body, so it's easier to sense various vital signs. But as human beings, we have been using our clothes for a long, long time to adapt and help us be in various different environments. And this notion of adaptability and comfort and having clothes carry us through different environments is by no means new. We are using our garments for all sorts of different reasons, including to be able to be comfortable in hostile environments. And most recently, I don't know how many of you saw this ad. Yesterday, we spoke a lot about smart fabrics and about jeans that can be completely hydrophobic. And Paul Smith had an athlete using a new type of wool that is fully stretchable. You can really actually do this and then go to work. One of the big issues, and we will talk a little bit about it today, is how do you take the drape and the softness and the suppleness of a garment and put electronics in it? But we are seeing in this area also changes. We have in conductive threads, whether they're used as antennas for RFIDs, or a lot of people like the Jacquard project trying to figure out how do you actually weave conductive threads into garments so you do away with wiring. We have stretchable electronics. We have batteries that not only are much smaller than what we saw in 1967, but also flexible. And of course, not only the size of electronics is becoming much smaller, so this is an accelerometer, which is really the same, the size of a grain of sand, the price has also dramatically dropped. And finally, and really importantly, we also have a lot more prototyping tools. So it took you even 5 years ago $20,000 to prototype in a couple of months. Now you can do with a 3D printer, weaving machine, flexible circuits, etc. So the tools that people have in their toolbox are both cheaper and easier to use. And when we talk about garments and technology, the relationship is not that far off. If you really think about it, the Jacquard loom is really the first computer in many ways. So the relationship is not as strange and far-fetched as we think. And maybe to see the acceleration, or what the consumer seems to ask for, this notion of comfort, of magic, of service, of clothing as service, can again be propelled possibly by the textile industry. So without further ado, I will have our 2 co-conversationalists introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll just launch into conversation.
Can you hear me? Hello? My name is Sarah Scaturo. I'm the head conservator at the Costume Institute in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where my primary duty is to handle the preservation of our collection of 37,000 objects and the safe display of all objects in our exhibitions. And I'm kind of here for my other hat, which is I've been for a very long time interested in the relationship between fashion and technology. And I don't actually see it that much of a deviation, because in conservation, it's very much art and technology and science, and so it's just slightly putting a little spin on it.
Randy Harward, I'm the VP of Materials, which covers all materials that Under Armour uses for both footwear and apparel. So we develop all inline materials and all long R&D projects as well. Most of that work goes out about 8 years. Our calendar for development of materials goes out that far. But I'm also in charge of our advanced concept development and apparel and our new design center for advanced concepts at Under Armour.
It's a lot.
So the first question is something that I've been struggling a lot of my clients ask is clearly to see what one of the challenges and the exciting parts about wearable technology is that you need a lot of pieces to come together, right? You need to have a good strategy, understand how the technology you want to introduce fits you with your brand's DNA. You have to understand electronics, but also fabric technology, manufacturing of electronics, manufacturing of textiles and apparel.
Check.
But do you think there is one area that could...
I'm going to switch you out.
Thank you. Do you think there is one area that could be a catalyst, could be that if we saw some development, some change, some move forward? Because what I've been finding when I talk to a lot of both people from the technology space and the apparel space is, that's why I call it the Wild Wild West scenario, where everybody's saying, well, if you do it, I'll do it. If you give me a good thread or connector, I'll make the garment. And then the thread or the connector people say, well, if you have a garment that you want to make, I'll make you a connector,
Right.
and so forth and so on. So
That's the $64,000 question, I guess, or $1 million these days. I think you've covered it well. What's gradually happening is a toolkit of components are becoming available very, very slowly, and I think probably properly slowly. And what will accelerate it is when you have a basic toolkit that allows you to no longer think about the thing you want to make, but the idea that virtually anything you can make. And when I say that, I mean in the sense of normal textiles or normal apparel. You have, honestly, 5 fiber types that we do all of our work in. Nylon, polyester, wool, cotton. It's a very small. There's a whole range of specialty yarns, but really we use 5 fibers. And 2 construction techniques, knits and wovens. And yes, there are versions of those all over the place, but that little tiny palette is enough for any designer to envision tens of thousands, if not millions, of designs that do what they need them to do. They make you comfortable, or they make you look good, or feel better, or perform better. And we don't think of the yarns and the fiber types and knitting and weaving as technology anymore. It's just pervasive. So at some point, I think wearables will reach this point at which we don't think of them as wearables any more than we think about wearing polyester or wearing cotton. It is my clothing.
Yeah, right on. I was really interested that you brought up the idea of prototyping and production, and I think one of the major hindrances is that frankly the wearables can't run at the pace that fashion is running at, and even fashion designers are dropping left and right because they just can't sustain this pace. And so this aesthetic renewal that needs to happen consistently, I think that's one of the major hindrances, that engineers just can't speak the language of fashion at this point. And we've said this before, I feel like I'm, refreshing, the same record over and over, but there needs to be some sort of translation translator, essentially, and maybe that is in the toolkit. There's this translation device that can happen.
I think that's a really good point. So you referenced, in a way, fast fashion,
right?
or this desire to, this calendar that the fashion world has that is becoming shorter and shorter, which clearly is very different from the electronics calendar, especially when the toolkit is in development. But it's interesting because on the one hand, you have this fast fashion and how do you grow more and make more faster, and then you have a very large conversation around sustainability. And you both, I know, very, very passionate about sustainability. You've created an exhibit, you've talked a lot about it, and you come from a real tradition in that. Do you think that on the one hand, we can say, oh, wow, all this new wearable technology, more things to put, more lithium to go in the trash, more silicon that we don't know what we're going to do with. We have phones that don't live more than 2 years. You know, it's become, they have a built-in obsolescence. So they're kind of catching up with the obsolescence of clothes. But do you think there might be an opportunity with wearable technology to reframe that question of sustainability? And how do we bring the two? I mean, I know it's a very difficult question, but you're both, in terms of, you're passionate both about sustainability and you're very knowledgeable about materials. So what do you see in that tension? And if you look about materials, sustainability, and smart materials and smart fabrics, or just not just fabrics, how do those three things dance together?
Want to bite it off first?
Well, I mean, one way to approach it would be to just say, you know, wearables are not fashion. They don't have to operate on the fashion timeline. They are a distinct and separate thing. And then that means that we can use them longer. Although you do have this built-in obsolescence, or as we were speaking earlier, you actually design things so that they can be broken down into their constituent parts and in essence reused or recycled. Which for me, putting on my other hat as a conservator, frightens me because I, you know, get in these new objects that are made from amazing synthetics and circuitry, and I'm just so frightened that I'm only going to have them in our collection for 10 or 20 years because they're going to self-destruct. So, I mean...
we were talking earlier about a product that I'm making, and she's like, that's not going to last long enough for me to conserve it.
Yeah, and so that's...
From a sustainability perspective, that's great, because
really
it's going to break
thing.
Down,
right,
as opposed to have it not breaking down. It's one thing to have one in your museum, and another to have them in wardrobes around the world and in the trash, right?
Right.
I think the issue of sustainability will win.
Yeah, it has to.
We hope so, right? If we want to be here for a little bit longer.
And it'll just be an efficiency thing. I look at sustainability the same way that I look at sort of the efficiency built into the Industrial Revolution and the phenomenon of the quality movement of the late 60s and early 70s, where the kind of quality that you have in products now is just expected. You expect even the very cheap and inexpensive things you buy to be very reliable and efficient and not break. And that has just become a level playing field. If you can't make products that do that, you don't exist. I think most of our products will continue in this vein in wearables or any other technology. So the sustainability movement, which is really about efficiency and who can do the job solve the problem in the most elegant and efficient way, is going to win. There will be lots of trashy, gimmicky things in the meantime that won't survive. That's my feeling about it. But if we continue kind of on the earlier discussion that I had, where we don't think of them as wearables. We just think of it as we've now made clothing that does more of what you need it to do. It keeps you warmer in more environments. It keeps you drier when you need to be dry. You're more comfortable in it because of the way it handles moisture. You might even have something that cleans easier or cleans itself because of the inherent technology in it. Those things can be necessarily more expensive, and they need to be, which is a big barrier for the whole wearables technology business, because people don't believe that it's going to last, and they do believe it has obsolescence, so therefore the cost doesn't justify what they're getting out of it. But if that equation begins to change, and there's true value and longevity and extra function, then we would be making fewer things that last longer, and in the end, that's much better. Right now, fast fashion is just about 3 washes and people throw it away, and that is an enormous landfill issue. Apparel and consumer care are almost the largest impact you have on this planet. Mm-hmm. So wearables stand a chance of actually helping that.
So you bring a really interesting point, which is And I wonder, what is, from your point of view, as someone who's been with Patagonia before joining Under Armour, which has a very, very strong stance against, towards how they envision the future, and now with Under Armour, and you're in a very incredibly major cultural institution. What do you think is the role of brands and of cultural institutions in changing that mindset, in, we call it educating the consumer, making this value chain more, more apparent? And initially I had to ask this for a different, not so much the material point of view, but we've been hearing more and more that, oh, we are so caught on into our devices. Even Sean Parker, who was the founder of Napster and then one of the key founders of Twitter, recently in an interview said, or in a conference said that he doesn't want his kids to use social media. He thinks that we've created a world that is a little bit out of hand, that we have all become really narcissistic. He doesn't think it's the job of the Facebooks of the world to change it because they just need to make money, but as a society, we should respond to that and be more diligent. So as maybe wearable technologies have the opportunity to be a catalyst or point a different way forward in how we use our materials, do you also think that wearable technology can make us more narcissistic and more closed in into our world, or could potentially open us up to the world because now we're not like this all the time? And do you see is it Under Armour's job to have a say in that? Or what's the role of a museum and exhibitions and educational outreaches in framing this conversation and how we live in society with technology?
That was such a small question that
It's all my questions
I'm
together.
like, I better write down some answers.
It's all the questions together.
She put that question to me in an email. I'm like, oh my Lord.
Glad you're going first.
And the first thing I wrote
it's
here.
going to be easy, right?
First thing I wrote was, those trends, companies might think they drive them, but they don't. Somewhere in this conversation, we have to get to the Bill Gates comment that when Vista, I don't know any of you even remember Vista, was so terrible a program, and somebody asked him on stage when he was going to come out with a new version, and he said, I hate that question because I'm always wrong. And he said, but yeah, we're all always wrong in technology. If we look at the 1 to 2 year time frame, which they're asking me about, I will overestimate what is possible, or I will overpredict what I think is going to happen in the world, to your question. And we're always absolutely wrong. Our strategies as a company are always wrong. But if you ask me in the 10-year time frame, what's going to happen or what society will be like using our tools, we always grossly underestimate what actually happens. Certainly wearables are in that 10-year window, right? Because we can see the technologies evolving. So how pervasive they become and exactly what we think of them as. Is it just garments, or are we still talking about wires and circuits? I doubt that, right? It'll just be pervasive clothing that does more of what you want it to do. So I think the trends will take care of themselves, because if the technologies are successful, they'll become more complex and more human as a result. They'll be as complicated and intertwined as we are. Otherwise, we won't be able to respond to them. But I don't think it's going to stay so simple the way it is today, with certain platforms being new to society and therefore driving a tremendous amount of attention in 5 platforms in the world maintain most of the traffic in social media. That will change.
Really interesting viewpoint, thank you. It's actually, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I think
it gives you really good perspective, and we're talking about having perspective, and when we look at materials, at trends, to really be able to look at the 10-year out and realizing things are not going to be the way they are today. And I always bring the example, Facebook did not exist 10 years ago. 10 years ago, that's not a very long time ago.
Yeah.
And it now catalyzes a lot of conversation. So things will keep changing.
It's crazy, but I thought of Michael Pollan, his book, The Botany of Desire, where he poses the question, because corn is now everywhere, and it's in all of our foods and packaged foods. And he says, he asked, has corn used us to be successful, or do we use corn? And he says it's actually not an easy question to answer. He poses the same question about lawn grass, that the certain varieties of lawn grass are now pervasive all over the world, and we mow them every week and everything. And he said, did the grass, take over? Because it rules our life. He's like, I'm not sure anymore. And I think that's what we will talk about when we talk about wearables and technology.
That's an interesting point. The archaeologist Ian Hodder has this theme or theory of the entanglement of objects, and how the more objects we accrue, the deeper and more deeply entangled we get, and we can't get out of this entrapment, in essence. So it's a beautiful point there that you just made. I think the role of a major, cultural institution, particularly the curatorial perspective, is to actually look out at the world, at what is happening, and hopefully respond creatively and productively to those challenges. I think you just saw that at the museum at FIT with the global fashion capitals, or their fashion and technology. And then, of course, our next spring show, which is Manus Ex Machina, the hand in the machine, and it's really dealing with what is happening to fashion now in the age of technology. Little plug for that.
An incredible show. So before we open it up to questions, last question is to questions from the audience. Is there anything in terms of wearable technology out there today that you think fascinates you, you find interesting, or reversely, you really don't care at all and you think it's quite destructive in some way or the other, and kind of takes the conversation of what wearable technology could be back as opposed to forward?
Well, I think I don't like the Apple Watch. I just think it's redundant and ugly. I don't wear a watch anyway, though, so it doesn't really apply to my life. But I would say I really like the expressive wearables, the imaginative, creative, playful ones, in particular the type that Despina has produced in the past. And one of my favorites is the Click Sneaks. It's a pair of sneakers that evokes the clicking of high heels walking down the street.
Oh my God.
If anybody wants to mass produce them, let me know.
I like the moments of poetry.
To my point, who would have predicted that?
I know, right? I do think technology has a great positive potential, and so I like to see the beautiful areas of that.
I like a lot of it, as long as it's not gimmicky. So I think people right now are less expressive with it and more looking for function, something that can make their lives better and healthier. And that, because it's just been the easiest place to introduce it,
what we call the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, the sensors and the GPS tracking and things like that have been, I think, very helpful. No mystery, Under Armour's very invested in this. We have 150 million users that track their workouts and bike rides, and every day, tens of millions of those people are tracking everything they eat against their performance. No joke. And they, challenge each other, and they make friendships, and they work out because they know I do this. I have a group of friends in my UA record, and if I don't work out, they give me shit. So I do go work out, and it helps me, and I do think that's been very, very healthy.
But the more sociable aspect of computing, which of wearable technology, it's in a way, sometimes I say that a lot of the wrist devices are more of a prop. It's more of a trigger to do the right thing.
Right.
But then what's interesting is past that prop is this community that is built around, which I find very powerful.
There's a little strange thing that came along with this, and I'm not sure where it will go, but certainly medical benefits are increasing. And last year I had a heart attack and ended up having bypass surgery and all that. And when I started exercising again, at the same time I started wearing sensors to keep track of my heart rate and blood pressure and things like that. And I found that in very short time, that system had trained me to know what my blood pressure is. I know what my heart rate is and my blood pressure is every minute of the day. I tell you, after I eat something, I know how much salt I've had because I can know. So it has been an invaluable lesson, kind of a biofeedback session that lasted 3 months or so that trained me to be much more in tune with my body. And that kind of thing is not prevalent yet, but it will be.
So it's about building insight and positive feedback loops.
Yeah.
Any closing thoughts before we open it up to the audience?
Well, I still think that it works for health, but it doesn't work for fashion yet. We're just not there yet. But
It's coming.
it may be.
What do you guys think? Is it coming? And
Yeah.
any questions? Do you mind using the microphone? Thank you.
So this is really interesting because it's inevitable that we're going to have all this technology in our clothing, and just what you described about your experience is really enlightening because that's exactly what's happening in medicine. But I think one of the issues is that we have a premise right now that doesn't allow us to think about how to design an object for its end of life and reuse it, recycle it, and move it back into the material stream. And so how do you think about incorporating, and what questions do you incorporate at the outset of your product development when you design this kind of intelligent fabric or material that will need to be reused, recycled, but it's not necessarily as you said, it's not necessarily changed with fashion. So the word fashion is kind of becomes a little bit obsolete in all of this. So how do you, what questions do you have to ask in order to enter this discourse about what the next generation of intelligent wearables are?
Many questions in there, but the main one I'm hearing is, are we designing things in a smart way for the future? I would say there's a lot of it that's not, just like in any industry. But the ones that are rising to the surface as fairly widely accepted, well thought out, elegant products, I call them, have a lot of sensibility built into them. And this is on nothing but the increase. I think maybe the general public may not realize that in the world of materials, be it textiles or just about any other kind of plastic or metal material, there is a tremendous effort to make good decisions at the design stage to minimize the use of dangerous materials or non-recyclable materials and maximize efficiency with the existing materials. A lot of that is driven by price, surprisingly.
Which is not the worst thing in the world because that creates a self-sustainable.
Yeah, the materials that end up being easy to use over and over again are much more competitive than those that are rare and hard to dispose of and things like that. So I'm fairly hopeful about the design of these products. There are still some very hard components that are hard to pull apart if you get into the true kind of logic components in apparel. But my view is that that is a phase, and that over time, the apparel itself will have no hard components in it. And we have nothing but improving computing capacity. So our phones and things like that are on, what's that, Moore's Law?
Yes.
Just this log scale of computing power will allow a garment that delivers a very dirty, ugly signal about what it's doing to a device that can sort it out because it has the power to do it. We won't need these hard connections.
I think there's a question there.
So I guess my question is, okay. So my question is about powering, electronics, which has always been, I think, one of the bigger problems. I think, Desmina, you showed something with a battery pack that was bigger than any purse I've ever carried around. But I'm wondering if a couple things. One, if there are alternatives to sort of what we see, what we think of as a battery, right? Because, and then the other thing is, you know, with a lot of press these days about cell phones and what they're emitting and the potential that they're emitting something that isn't good for our bodies. So as we start to move into this, are the batteries or the what powers it going to pose those same kinds of problems? Is anybody looking at that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, very much
Well,
so.
yeah, I know for our next exhibition, if we do display wearables, in particular Hussein Chalayan, one of the problems is they're still in the prototype phase. And my job is now to try to figure out how to keep these running nonstop for 3 months. And I'm not an engineer. And so I think, you know, we're going to have to pull power. It's going to have to be hardwired of some sort. And I think you're asking a really dead-on question about power. I mean, where does it come from? In many ways.
Yeah, there's, as you can imagine, it's the big question everybody's trying to solve. Do we wire, you know, a single power source and then have to transport that power?
Right.
And in apparel, that's a big problem. Or do we figure out how to make a material power itself, or with solar power, or with heat, which has been very successfully demonstrated, or just you know, there's a really interesting technology evolving that's dealing with something in apparel, at least in outdoor apparel, which I have been in for many decades. You have something called vapor barrier pressure between the inside of a garment and the outside. It's actually quite powerful, and it forces. That's how Gore-Tex works. It can force an awful lot of moisture through a membrane. Turns out you can harvest that, sort of like a little hydroelectric plant. So there's all kinds of efforts like that, and I think these are the elegant solutions that will win. The kind of the battery approach is, in my view, a phase.
I think in many ways what I say, you know, I teach a class on wearable technology at NYU, and what I always tell my students is that this is a wearables class, but it's also design on steroids, because you really have all these very big problems that you have to solve at the same time. The human factors, the social factor, the emotional component, the technology, the manufacturing. And ultimately, I think, and I think both of you pointed to that in a different ways, it's about changing our mindset. If we keep thinking about technology and fashion and how do we put all of them together, we're never going to see something new. But if we change, if we start looking at it from a different point of view, what is heat, what is the power, what is energy, what is the sun, what is the relationship between the environment with each other, and just kind of turn it around and lose some of our assumptions and rethink of that space, I think we'll see a lot more interesting developments, and maybe that is the catalyst, changing the whole mindset.
Right.
Do you mind using the microphone so everyone, or, thank you.
Thank you. 3 great people to talk about the topic, and I'm glad you guys started to tease out the difference between fashion and wearables, because I think people always consider them the same. So there's so many ways of trying to get to the point where fashion and technology can really work. What do you think would be the most effective way of actually getting technology in fashion for it to actually work? Is it through education, manufacturing? What would be the most effective way?
I think a lot of it is the toolkit, right? If you have a designer, whether it's a textile designer or an apparel designer, and they want to experiment with an idea, everyone will tell you, oh, designers are such visual people, they want to see it, right? So if you try to give them a course or explain to them how it's going to work, it's not going to be very effective. But if you could have, it doesn't necessarily have to be them, but someone in their company that can very quickly prototype, how does it feel if I have this fabric and when I jump, it lights up, or these sneakers, when I walk, they do X, Y, Z, then they can start seeing it. But if that period is a 3-month developing the prototype, it's just not viable. So I think a lot of it is around the tools, and also at the mindset, how we think about the. But I just have one quick comment on fashion and wearable technology. Sometimes people ask me, what do you think is the biggest market for e-textiles and wearable technology? And to me, it's like asking, what is the big market for cotton? You can make nurses' uniforms and sheets, and you can make T-shirts, and you can make. So if we get it right, you're going to see it in health, in enterprise, in fashion, and so forth and so on, as long as it's easy to integrate and it's easy to manufacture, which neither of the two is really the case. Would you, anything to add?
Yeah. I made a similar comment last year in a panel here, and I'll repeat it. I don't think there's a shortage of ideas, and when the toolkit comes around so that it's easy to use, it'll be great, and it'll be absorbed into designs. But the problem that I face as I interview a lot of young designers and stuff like that come into the company is they don't think holistically enough about the problem. And the extent to which they are thinking about real world problems and real needs of users, then the products that they develop are much more, I use the term elegant a lot. They tend to solve the problem in the most efficient and aesthetically pleasing way. And yet when they're trying to embed wearables into a design, because that's the job, it ends up looking very kludgy. And so students that have a good liberal arts education and have a good perspective on world issues and the actual problems that people run into every day do a better job than those who are really focused only on design.
So it goes back to your question about asking the right questions in the beginning and adopting what we would call a user-centric design, which it sounds weird. Like, why wouldn't you have a human-centered design? Because we design for humans. But very often we don't. Right? So it's really about that process and about that approach. Any other questions?
This is fun.
I told you.
Hi, I have more like questions in regards to conservation, like more for Sarah. So my first one is, which time period, designer, or textile entails the most issues in regards to conservation, and particularly the pieces you have just diagnosed with a terminal lifespan of 10 to 15 years?
I can think of two examples that spring to mind. The first would be, older silk, net, chiffon, just particularly made around the turn of the 20th century, tends to crumble or powder into dust. So that's a big problem. You can't actually put a needle through it, so what do you do? And we've got a variety of approaches, and I'm happy to talk with you more about that. The more exciting one, I think, that I'm working on now is we are collecting contemporary fashion, and a lot of what's being made has fantastic materials that are totally unproven with regards to aging properties. And my job is to really look ahead and try to figure out, how do we save the circuitry, how do we save the e-textiles, the PVCs, the silicones. And it's still an emerging field. There is no one magic bullet, but we're investigating cool and cold storage techniques, anoxic storage, a variety of approaches that might work for some materials. But in order to really go that far and to make these decisions, I need to be doing, working with scientists to really get the analytics down and the proper analyses. And so it's a fantastic, exciting field, and I feel like I'm just kind of embarking on it, and I'm so glad that I have the resources and the support and the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art kind of behind me and the scientists, but they're two very different problems, in terms of that. You're going to face the same problems with the new things that you're facing from before. I am, and in fact, I was telling them earlier, we have a dress from 1927. It's a patu called Advertising, which is a typical flapper-style dress that had an embroidered Eiffel Tower on it, and at the very top it had a little light bulb that you could just pop it through and then just put the wire underneath the shirt, and it had a big battery pack that slipped into a pocket. and the woman at the party could just flick it off and on. And it was actually, he called it advertising. And so, you know, things haven't changed.
The more they change, the more they stay the same. as they
And
say.
so from a conservation standpoint, obviously, if I were to display it now, I would probably use an LED. I would not, there's no way I could use the original lighting source.
With the silk, compared to what they're making today, same kind of problem.
Well, we will actually try and design
Yeah.
the products so they fall apart.
Yeah, I mean, that's,
Honestly, so they can be recycled and reused and intentionally have a lifespan built into them.
so there's an interesting theory in conservation about trying to understand the artist's intent in preserving things. So should I try to even preserve your stuff then?
That is a really interesting question indeed.
If you want it to fall apart.
Do we have time for any? Please. No, you hold the batons.
I'll do quick.
please.
I teach introductory fashion trends, and I show them the next black. Is there any? And I've taken them to the 3D print show, and to get them exposed to that. Is there any other video and/or educational tidbit? Because they really love the next black, but you guys are the experts.
Do you all know that Next Black is a documentary about the future of fashion, and it showcases, actually Patagonia is one of the companies that showcased Suzanne Lee, who has been experimenting with creating fabric from cellulose, and a few, I think there's a Studio XO, which is really focusing on wearables. In terms of a video, or nothing really comes to mind, but if you give me your card, if something comes up,
I can tell you what I do is I have to force myself to go on to Google and search. And it's amazing what turns up every week if you do that. And you can stay very much on top of things. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing.
I mean, things leak out that shouldn't, even through social media. Yeah, I got a friend who works somewhere that I compete with, and she posted on Facebook a project, and I'm looking at the whiteboard behind her going, oh my Lord. I called her up and said, take it down.
Take it down now.
She didn't even realize. So no, there's a lot of information out there.
So my question is for Sarah, because Randy, you already answered this, and how the products that you are working on and what you guys are making, how it's changed or affected your life. So does this conservation position change the way you shop in your own personal life? Does it change what you buy and
It does.
consume?
Yeah.
We've talked about that.
Yeah, I used to do a lot of vintage, and because I've now seen what really good vintage is, I'm really picky, and actually I don't buy as much vintage anymore as I should, oddly. But I don't shop a lot. I don't like to shop, really. It's, I buy a few investment pieces, and I keep things for a very long time, and so I wear new things every day, it looks like, but I've just had things in my closet for so long. I don't do what Marie Kondo does, how you throw everything away. Like, I can't do that. I'm just a collector by, I just keep everything. Speaking, though, of how technology could affect conservation, one of the interesting things is that we are looking into 3D printing, replacement prototypes for buttons, or, things that need to be fixed on the garments. We're also 3D scanning storage forms. I don't know if you saw our Charles James exhibition, but these sculpted gowns or Dior gowns from the 50s need to be on almost like a body, an archival body. And so we've been 3D scanning and working with a company to just have these archival materials milled to spec, and so I don't have to have my interns slaving away cutting ethafoam down. So I'm trying to look at these really interesting techniques and see how we can apply them to conservation and make my job easier and more interesting.
Any more questions? Okay, well, thank you so much for a very inspiring conversation.
That was fun.